Economic growth represents the most powerful and transformative force in human history, the essential engine that has propelled humanity from universal poverty and shortened lives to unprecedented levels of material comfort, health, and opportunity. At its core, economic growth, typically measured as the increase in the real gross domestic product of a nation, is not merely an abstract statistical concept favored by economists and policymakers. It is the fundamental process through which societies generate the resources necessary to improve human welfare, solve pressing problems, and expand the realm of the possible. The importance of economic growth extends far beyond the simplistic notion of having more stuff. It is the foundational prerequisite for nearly every valued social outcome. Longer and healthier lives, greater educational attainment, reduced absolute poverty, technological and medical advancement, environmental protection, and the cultivation of arts and culture. Without sustained economic growth, societies face a zero-sum struggle over finite resources, where the improvement of one group's condition necessarily comes at the expense of another's. With growth, the possibility emerges for a positive-sum future where living standards can rise across the entire population, innovation can address previously intractable challenges, and humanity can invest in a better future for subsequent generations. To question the importance of economic growth is to overlook the stark lessons of history and the vast disparities that still separate growing economies from stagnant ones today. The most direct and morally compelling argument for economic growth lies in its demonstrated power to lift populations out of abject poverty. Before the sustained economic growth initiated by the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority of humanity lived in conditions that would be considered extreme poverty by today's standards, with the global poverty rate estimated at over 80% in the early 19th century. The economic growth that began in Britain and spread across Europe, North America, and eventually to parts of Asia initiated the greatest improvement in human living standards in history. As economies grew, they generated the capital, infrastructure, and productive capacity to employ people in increasingly productive activities, raising wages and creating goods and services that became increasingly affordable. The correlation is undeniable. Countries that have experienced sustained periods of rapid economic growth, such as China, South Korea, and India in recent decades, have achieved the most dramatic poverty reduction the world has ever witnessed. In China alone, since initiating market reforms in 1978, over 800 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty, a feat that would have been utterly impossible without decades of near double-digit annual economic growth. This growth provided the government with the tax revenues to invest in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, while simultaneously creating millions of new jobs in manufacturing and services. Growth does not automatically eliminate inequality, and the distribution of its benefits matters profoundly. But without the expanding economic pie that growth provides, the fight against poverty becomes a purely redistributive exercise with limited potential for lasting success. Closely intertwined with poverty reduction is the profound impact of economic growth on human health and longevity. There exists a powerful, empirically robust correlation between a nation's GDP per capita and the life expectancy of its citizens. This relationship is not coincidental but causal. Economic growth generates the resources that enable societies to invest in public health infrastructure, clean water systems, sanitation networks, waste management, which are foundational to preventing infectious diseases. It funds the scientific research that leads to medical breakthroughs, from antibiotics and vaccines to advanced surgical techniques and cancer treatments. It creates the wealth that allows governments and individuals to pay for hospitals, medical equipment, and trained healthcare professionals. The historical evidence is overwhelming. As Western economies grew during the 19th and 20th centuries, life expectancy began its remarkable climb from around 30-40 years to over 70-80 years today. The same pattern is now repeating itself across the developing world. Child mortality, perhaps the most sensitive indicator of a society's overall well-being, plummets as economies grow. Parents in growing economies have fewer children, confident that each one will survive to adulthood and invest more in each child's health and education. A virtuous cycle known as the demographic transition. Economic growth, therefore, is not just about material wealth. It is quite literally a matter of life and death, providing the means to conquer the diseases and conditions that have plagued humanity for millennia. Beyond these fundamental metrics of survival, economic growth is the primary driver of technological and scientific progress. A stagnant economy, one that merely reproduces itself at the same level year after year, generates little surplus for research and development. It is the wealth created by growth that funds both the public and private investment in R&D that leads to innovation. The entire technological landscape of the modern world, from smartphones and the internet to mRNA vaccines and renewable energy technologies, is the product of investments made possible by economic growth. Furthermore, growth creates the demand for innovation. As societies become wealthier, their citizens demand better goods, services, and solutions to problems, creating market incentives for entrepreneurs and corporations to innovate. The relationship is symbiotic. Innovation drives growth by creating new industries and improving productivity, while growth provides the capital and the market for further innovation. This cycle of growth and innovation is responsible for solving problems that once seemed insurmountable. It has enabled humanity to produce more food on less land, communicate instantaneously across the globe, and develop energy sources that can power modern life while reducing environmental impact. The potential solutions to our greatest future challenges, including climate change, resource scarcity, and pandemics, will almost certainly require significant economic resources to develop and deploy at scale. A growing economy is, therefore, not a luxury, but a necessity for funding the innovation required for humanity's long-term survival and flourishing. From a social and political perspective, economic growth acts as a vital lubricant, reducing conflict and creating the conditions for greater social stability and political freedom. While the relationship between wealth and democracy is complex, history suggests that sustained economic growth and the emergence of a large, educated middle class often create pressure for more accountable, participatory forms of government. The famous Lipset hypothesis in political science posits that economic development fosters the social and cultural conditions conducive to democracy, including higher levels of education, urbanization, and independent civil society. Economically growing societies are typically more capable of managing social tensions because they can address grievances through the distribution of new wealth rather than through bitter, zero-sum conflicts over a fixed pie. When citizens see their living standards improving and have opportunities for upward mobility, they are more likely to support the existing social and political order. Conversely, economic stagnation or contraction often breeds populism, xenophobia, and political instability as groups compete for a shrinking pool of resources. Growth also provides the fiscal capacity for governments to build effective social safety nets, unemployment insurance, pensions, disability benefits, that protect citizens from the vicissitudes of the market and personal misfortune, thereby enhancing social cohesion and resilience. The importance of economic growth extends into the critical realm of environmental sustainability, presenting what appears to be a paradox but is in reality a dynamic relationship. The early stages of industrialization are often associated with significant environmental degradation, as seen in the smog-filled cities of 19th century Britain or the polluted rivers of rapidly industrializing nations today. This has led some to advocate for degrowth as an environmental strategy. However, the evidence suggests that while growth may initially increase environmental pressures, beyond a certain point, described by the environmental Kuznets curve, it begins to facilitate environmental improvement. Wealthier societies have the resources and the public demand to invest in cleaner technologies, stricter environmental regulations, and conservation efforts. They can afford to shift from dirty fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources, invest in advanced waste management and recycling systems, and set aside land for parks and nature preserves. The most polluted places on Earth are often not the richest countries, but poor and middle-income countries still in the early, dirtiest phases of industrial development. Furthermore, it is primarily wealthy, growing economies that are driving the innovation in renewable energy, battery storage, and carbon capture technologies that are essential for addressing global climate change. The challenge, therefore, is not to stop growth, but to steer it, to decouple economic activity from environmental impact through technological innovation and smart policy, a task that requires significant economic resources, and thus growth itself. Finally, economic growth is essential for maintaining and enhancing national and global security, as well as for addressing future uncertainties. A growing economy provides a nation with a tax base to fund its defense, diplomacy, and development assistance programs. It enhances its geopolitical influence and its capacity to shape international rules and norms. More fundamentally, growth creates a buffer against unforeseen shocks, whether they be financial crises, natural disasters, or pandemics. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a stark illustration of this principle. Countries with stronger economic foundations were able to deploy massive fiscal stimulus to support households and businesses, fund the rapid development and distribution of vaccines, and maintain their healthcare systems under extreme duress. Poorer countries, with less fiscal space, faced far more devastating economic and human consequences. Growth builds resilience. It creates the surplus that allows societies to invest in preparedness, to build robust infrastructure, and to fund scientific research that can anticipate and mitigate future risks. In a world facing increasingly complex and interconnected challenges, from climate change and cyber threats to global public health crises, the capacity to respond effectively is inextricably linked to a society as economic vitality. In conclusion, the importance of economic growth is multifaceted and profound. It is the primary mechanism through which humanity has overcome the Malthusian trap of subsistence living and has launched itself on a trajectory of improving health, knowledge, and comfort. It funds the innovation that solves old problems and creates new possibilities. It reduces the kind of desperate poverty that crushes human potential and provides the resources to manage social conflicts and environmental challenges. This is not to claim that growth is an unalloyed good or that its benefits are automatically distributed fairly. The quality of growth matters immensely. It must be inclusive and sustainable. Inequality must be managed, and environmental externalities must be priced and regulated. But to dismiss the imperative of growth is to ignore the stark reality that without it, the prospects for continued human progress are dim. The central task of our time is not to abandon economic growth, but to reinvent it, to harness its undeniable power to create a world that is not only wealthier, but also healthier, more secure and more sustainable for generations to come. The engine of progress must not be shut off. It must be steered toward a brighter destination for all.